Over the years, I've had the privilege to sit down and consult with some of the most impressive and successful bodybuilders of all time. I've learned directly from guys in the Arnold era, guys like Franco Columbu, Serge Nubret, and Frank Zane. And I've trained with and spent countless hours experiencing firsthand the methods of top bodybuilders today, guys currently on the Olympia stage. And one major variable that I've always seen a drastic difference between these two eras was training. They all ate high protein diets, not much difference there. They all dieted down to peak for a show. Contest prep has always been pretty straightforward. And they all trained hard in the gym. Intensity and consistency was always high among all of them. But the major difference I found was the actual training they did, and more specifically, the structure of that training in relation to their physique goals. Today, it's pretty straightforward. In the off season, when not competing, the goal is to spend as much time as possible in a caloric surplus, gaining as much weight and muscle mass as possible. At the same time, training as hard as possible to facilitate that growth process. For most bodybuilders, that's 4 to 5 days per week in the gym. And generally, they're hitting one body part per session, maybe two. They're training as hard as they possibly can to put all that extra food to good use. Now, this can be done for 6 to 8 months out of the year, depending on the competitor and whether or not they're competing, let's say, once per year. Now, come contest time, that's usually 3 to 4 months before the show, depending on the competitor. Contest prep will start, and calories will be reduced with the goal of getting as lean as possible, all while maintaining that muscle mass that was built in the off season. Now, training will likely remain very similar, at least for the most part, with intensity as high as possible. That generally means the same amount of days in the gym, and workouts will look relatively similar to how they trained in the off season. Generally, training might only change the last few weeks before the contest. And there's nothing wrong with this approach at all. It works. It's built some of the most massive and muscular bodybuilders ever. But now, let's take a step back and compare that to what guys did in the 60s and 70s, which is drastically different. Now, if you do a quick Google search or you research online, you'll probably come across that classic high volume 6 day per week split, the one that's very similar to the one that you'll find in Arnold's Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding. And what do you hear from everyone? Overtraining, overtraining, overtraining. Or for those of you that wanted to experience it for yourself, you probably went right from a standard bro split into this high volume training split as listed. Maybe you used it to try and gain some mass, but after 2 to 3 months, you might have found yourself beat up and burnt out. And then, most likely, you went on to report the same exact things you hear online. Overtraining, overtraining, overtraining. But where you went wrong, and what most people don't understand is, that's not how this system was designed to be used. Not at all. But literally, all the guys back then trained like this. That's not a myth. That's actually how they trained. It's not an exaggeration. They all use this high volume training system. And whether you want to argue it works or it doesn't, just look at the physiques. And over the years, as I've spoken to many of these old school bodybuilders, I learned one very important thing. They didn't use this style of training as a standard year-round template, similar to how bodybuilders train today, where the off-season and pre-contest look the same. It wasn't follow this style of training in the off-season with more calories and then keep the training the same and reduce calories as the show approaches. That's not how they did things back then. The reality is, they approached their training similar to how virtually any other sport in the world is practiced. There were times in the year where training would be more intense and other periods of time where they would scale back on the training, rest more, or a complete layoff. The word off-season in bodybuilding generally describes a period of time where calories are very high and training is still intense. In fact, it's probably the hardest it is all year. In any other sport, off-season could mean a period of time where we scale back on the training for more rest or no training at all. And old school bodybuilders, they followed a similar approach. Very similar to how strength training athletes will peak for a contest. They start their training cycle X amount of weeks before a contest, and it gradually increases and peaks right at the height of a contest. I actually had a conversation with Frank Zane about this, where he broke down specifically what he would do every single year. He told me every year his goal was to peak in the autumn, or let's say he was specifically peaking for the Mr. Olympia contest. During the holidays, he wasn't in his peak shape. You can actually go online and find pictures of most of these bodybuilders outside of contest shape. This was a yearly thing for them. During the holiday times, he would back off his training and his diet and he would rest more. November through February, he was in the gym, but he wasn't doing that 6 day per week training split. And most guys during this period of the year, they would train 2, 3, maybe 4 days per week. The training volume was lower, and you might see guys doing upper and lower splits, full body training, or torso and limb split systems. And what Frank told me he would specifically do during this period of time is focus on bringing up a weak body part. He'd use that time where he had lower volume training, where his recovery was higher, when he had more rest, and he would use that extra energy to prioritize a lagging muscle group. Now, 6 months prior to the contest or when he wanted to peak, for him, that would start in April or May, he would start to kick his training back up, but only 80 to 90%. Now, that's where a modified version of that old school high volume classic split comes into play. Training volume and frequency and intensity would be slightly increased. This would be a similar style of training to my 5-day old school mass gain program. And the goal during this period of time was to peak somewhere in September or October. That's 6 months of progressive training throughout the year, and those crazy high volume, 6 to 8 per week training splits, they were only used the last 6 to 12 weeks before a contest. And in many cases, it could have even been shorter than that. You just don't hear about the training they did in between much because it wasn't as extreme. And naturally, these guys never trained that way for extended periods of time. And the interesting thing that not many people realize is the majority of muscle they built during training happened during that 6-month period of time, not the last 6 to 12 weeks. The more moderate 80 to 90% training is where they actually built the majority of their muscle mass. And weak body parts were completely built in the off season. Those muscles had the ability to grow when the volume for the rest of the body was much lower in comparison to contest prep. These guys all trained hard, even in the off season, but their training peaked before a contest. And what you read online about how these guys trained, it's just a snapshot of what their training was like the last few weeks before a contest. Do these high volume routines work? Of course they do. But you have to understand, if you're using these training routines in the off season, trying to build more muscle and using them for extended periods of time, and you're feeling overreached or under-recovered, just understand that you're not using these training programs as they were intended. That's exactly why I put together my training programs for you guys, to show you guys the actual training that might not get the most attention on the internet, but the training that actually built the most muscle for these guys. These are 4 to 5 day mass gain programs that still include higher volumes, higher frequencies, and old school mass gain training principles. But they also had recovery prioritized to build more muscle. The last weeks before a contest, it wasn't about getting bigger, it was about getting more defined, getting leaner. And as a result, muscle gain and recovery, it took a back seat. It was about training as much as possible to burn off every last bit of body fat. Even Arnold himself said that he would look to come into a contest partially overtrained. That's what most people don't understand about competitive bodybuilding training and nutrition. The training and nutrition plan that I followed before every bodybuilding contest was not sustainable long term. It got me shredded and in the best shape I ever was out of the entire year, but it wasn't sustainable beyond the 16 weeks that I did it. But it was also never expected to be done any longer than that. And it was understood that I could only train this way, diet this way, and hold that body fat percentage for a short period of time. So if you're looking to build more muscle and want to do so using proven old school bodybuilding training methods, I highly recommend you check out my 5-day old school mass gain program in the description below. And as always, if you guys want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.